When we plant seeds, roots take hold in the ground. And the roots are the substance from which whatever is planted begins to grow. And as human beings, we feel the need to put down roots in places that we like to call home. So my talk is about sharing some ideas that I have about the concept of home and the concept of home with God. We can say there's no place like home, and we can say it in two different ways, I think. So for example, if you've been away from your home for an extended period of time, maybe you have been away in your job. Maybe you've been on a long extended holiday. Maybe you've been in hospital or in prison. But in any case, you've been away from what's familiar to you for a long period of time. Well, that moment that you open the door, you walk in to see the familiar surroundings. Maybe you sit down, maybe you put the kettle on, but you just have that feeling there's no place like home. I'm so glad to be back. It's how I feel when I've been away for a considerable amount of time in the United States, visiting my family and friends. I get back, I drag my suitcase down the steps, I open the door, I step inside and feel this familiarity and think, oh, I'm so happy to be here. I'm so glad to be back home. But on a different level, on a deeper level, there's no place like home. Typically, when we're thinking of being home with God, there's no place on earth, no physical place like home with God, because God within us is our home. That is where our home is. Now, in our culture, we have a lot of phrases that talk about home. So I have just a few that I want to share with you. So the first one is home sweet home. Now, when I see this, my mind goes back to what I was taught when I was in school about the pioneers in the early days of American history, coming across the continent, building log cabins, and making a place for themselves to live. And this is what's called a sampler, which is an embroidery and needlework piece of art that they would create and hang up in their log cabins. And it's like a blessing of the place where they are, to say that they are home, sweet home. Now, another phrase, home is where the heart is. But actually, the phrase, home is where the heart is, can again be looked at two different levels, the physical and the spiritual. So the physical, home is where the heart is. My heart is in my body right now, physically, where I am. So this is my home. Wherever my heart is physically, that's where I can feel at home. If I'm going to visit my family and friends in the US, sometimes people will say to me, oh, when are you going back home? I must confess, I have to swallow a little bit of frustration because I haven't considered the US as my home in a very long time, decades, in fact. I acknowledge my biological connection because my family is there. And I acknowledge my cultural connection because I lived the first 22 years of my life there. And there is a lot of the culture that I have taken in within me and brought with me and lives with me. But my heart connection is there with people, but it isn't there with the place. And for some, it's the opposite. They may have come here to join family members. They may have come here to work or to get an education or to live here, and they still continue to call their place of birth their home. In the end, it's all a matter of the heart, where the heart is. Which leads us to the second spiritual level, the heart of consciousness. So home is where the heart is, the consciousness of God is, and it is all connected. It's bringing us back to being home with God, our connection with spirit, wherever we are. Another phrase that I came across, which is new to me, I haven't seen it before, is home is where the heart is. Home is where the heart is, the consciousness of God is, and it is all connected. It's bringing us back to being home with God, our connection with spirit, wherever we are. Another phrase that I came across, which is new to me, I haven't seen it before, Home isn't where you're from. It's where you find light when all grows dark. Now, this is a quotation by someone called Pierce Brown. I'm not sure who that is. I haven't come across the name before. And I don't know whether it's from a book or a play or a song or anything. But I think it's a lovely way to think about God as home, because God is our light. We are expressions of the divine light, and we turn to that light when we feel we are surrounded by darkness or when we feel away from our home. And we know the light is always shining, no matter where we are or what we see or what we feel, like the sun that shines beyond the clouds even when we can't see it. Many people think of heaven as their eternal home, a place somewhere away from the earthly life. And I remember my mom telling me, just before my dad died, he used to sit in front of the window in their living room in his wheelchair and look outside at the neighborhood. And I think she thought he was looking at the neighborhood. I think he might have had his thoughts elsewhere. But he used to say to her from time to time, I just want to go home. I just want to go home. And she'd say to him, you are home. What are you talking about? My dad had mild dementia, amongst other things, when he died. And I think she thought he didn't know where he was. But after a while, he would say to her, I just want to go home with the angels. I just want to go home and be with the angels. So then she knew that he was talking about dying. The author Neale Donald Walsch has written a series of books called Conversations with God. And one of those books is called Home with God in a Life That Never Ends. I found a couple of statements he made that speak to this idea of being home with God. The first one is, no matter which way you go, you cannot fail to get home. Each spiritual path we take takes us home, although some may be more arduous than others. He was writing in terms of death and dying, but I think this can be true for life as well, for our spiritual paths. Everything we do has the potential to awaken our awareness that we are indeed home with God. And the second statement that I've nicked from his book, home is a place called completion, complete awareness of who you really are. I love that. Home is a place called completion, complete awareness of who you really are. And I love that because it reminds me of the statement in the Bible attributed to Jesus where he says, you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, we think of perfect as flawless, faultless, with no imperfections. But for me, I like to reimagine it as saying you must be complete as your heavenly Father is complete. God is complete in its awareness of love, of strength, of power, of all that expression. When we can be complete in our awareness that we are expressions of the divine, when we get that, we know that we are home. But what if we're unsure or uncertain about how to find our way to God or to make a connection where we actually feel home with God? Going back to the title of my talk, There's No Place Like Home, actually comes from one of my favorite films, The Wizard of Oz. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with the story, but for the sake of my talk and just to support it a bit, I'll just briefly go over the story. Dorothy's a young girl who gets caught up in a tornado, and she's whisked from the black and white world of Kansas to the colorful world of Oz. Despite the fact that it's a beautiful place and she's never seen anything like it before, all she can think about is, I want to go back home. I must go back home. How can I get back home? What do I have to do to get back home? Who can I see that can get me home? She finds out there is someone called a wizard who everybody says If there's anybody who can get you back home, that's the one that's going to do it. So she sets her focus and she sets her mind on getting to Oz, the city of Oz, and finding this wizard. And on the way, she makes 3 friends. They also think that this wizard can help them get something that they haven't got, that they lack, their heart's desire. So there's a scarecrow who thinks he wants a brain, a tin woodman who thinks he wants a heart, and a lion who thinks he wants courage. Now, those are really 3 good aspects to have on our journey: wisdom, love, and courage, which can also be seen as strength. Dorothy has some challenges on the way to Oz. They come in the form of a wicked witch, but she also has support, and that comes in the form of a good witch. But eventually she reaches a stage where she is just ready to get home. She's been through all these things and she's ready to get home. And she thinks the wizard's going to do it for her. And it doesn't work out that way. And it often doesn't work out that way when we put all our faith into something outside of ourselves to get us what we desire. Now, there's nothing wrong with looking outside ourselves, as long as we're guided to do so by spirit, first to God and then to man as God directs. Because that guidance is something that will support us on our spiritual journey and support us in feeling home with God. So when Dorothy was left behind by the wizard, she felt a great sense of disappointment. She thought, I'll never get home now. I'll have to be here forever. But the good witch took her aside and said, now, you've come this far. You're so ready to go home. What have you learned on this journey? And she says, Dorothy says, if I ever go looking for my heart's desire again, I won't look any further than my own backyard. Because if it isn't there, I never really lost it to begin with. I've seen this film so many times, and before I came into Unity, every time she said that, I would scream at the television, that can't be right, because my heart's desire is not in the backyard of my Chicago home. There's more to the world than that. There has got to be. But Unity taught me to go deeper. And if I go deeper into the statement, if I ever go looking for my heart's desire again, I won't look any further than my own backyard. My heart's desire is God knocking on the door of my heart, letting me know all I need is already within me. As long as I let go of preconceptions and let God be God in and through and as me. Because if it isn't there, I never really lost it to begin with. It is here. And the only thing I may have temporarily lost is my awareness of it. And then, of course, the ultimate truth for Dorothy was when the good witch told her that she had the power all along to take herself back home. All she had to do was click the ruby slippers 3 times, close her eyes, and say, there's no place like home. There's no place like home. So that might be a nice, quick little meditation we could use if we're stuck in a really difficult place and it's safe to do so. Click your heels together, close your eyes, and say, there's no place like home. And we would add, with God. So apart from the inspiration from the Wizard of Oz, I was thinking about my own home and whether I could look at it through metaphysical eyes. How could I see the material aspects of my home? And how could I use them to enhance my spiritual journey? So I live in what's called a studio flat, which has 3 rooms. It has a bathroom toilet, a kitchen, and a combination lounge and bedroom, which I call a bed sitting room. So if I go through each of these rooms, what do they remind me about my connection with the divine? I do come in on an entrance hall, and that reminds me of a book by Unity Minister Reverend Ellen Davenport called Hell in the Highway, Light at the Door. I haven't read it, but the theme is, as I understand it, that the hallway is the time between decisions when we're uncertain about what will come next. So I see my hallway as the entrance to the interior of my home, and until I decide which door I'm going to go through, I am in a moment of uncertainty. But I'm still home, and we are still home with God during those moments of indecision and uncertainty. And if I open the door on my left, I'm in my bathroom and toilet, and that's a place of cleanliness and release. Here, I'm reminded of the importance of releasing anything that is standing in the way of my good, anything that no longer serves me. Holding on to negative thoughts about ourselves keeps us down. And when we do let go, we feel lighter, both physically and spiritually. This is also a place of cleanliness. I use water to take a shower or cleanse my face or wash my hands. Water is a symbol of life. We talk about living waters. And it reminds me of being in the flow of life, in the flow of consciousness, in the flow of being home with God. And if I stand outside my bathroom, I turn to the left and I go into the kitchen. And the kitchen is where we keep and prepare food, the nourishment for our body. And we decide what we're going to eat and create a meal for ourselves. It reminds me to keep and use food that will nourish me physically and emotionally. And if I get the balance off, like a little bit too much of the unhealthy foods and not so much of the healthy foods, there is a challenge of indigestion. But there is also food for the soul, which feeds our connection with God. And I'm reminded that there can be spiritual indigestion as well. If I take in too much and not give myself time for absorption and quiet times of reflection. And then standing outside my kitchen, the door to the left leads me to my bed sitting room. And it's where I'm engaged with reading, with music, with entertainment. It contains my television, my books, my records, my computer. These are my windows to the world, particularly now during the pandemic and with all the restrictions. I find inspiration and support here. And I also have my bed, which is for me where I can be rested, restored, and renewed. This is where the balance is, to be inspired and motivated, to take that to a quiet place and let it unfold for the highest and best, to take it home with God. So that's how I use my physical home to symbolically connect with my spiritual home, my home with God. I'm guessing most of you all will probably live in houses or larger places than I have, with other rooms that might be reminders of spiritual aspects. So for example, you might have a dining room, and that would be a place to gain nourishment and share meals, to take what comes to us in inspiration and share it willingly with others and the world. You might have a basement. This could be a place of storage for things we don't use very often, for ideas that are not part of our everyday living, but perhaps we're reluctant to totally release. You might have an attic, another place of storage, but perhaps of treasured things. Basement thought might take us below, and an attic thought might take us above. You might have a conservatory, a place mostly filled with light because of the windows, a place of resting and feeling the lightness of things, feeling the lightness of our being. And you might have a garage, a place where motor vehicles can be kept, that we use that for traveling. Might be more storage, and those might be things needed from time to time that help with renewal and repair. So looking at a home in a metaphysical way, that works for me on the principle of using our human experiences to take us to spiritual expression, because in the end of the day, we are human beings having a spiritual experience. I'd like to finish with some quiet time and to share some thoughts from Unity Minister Reverend Ed Townley, who summarizes spirituality of home very well. There is a story told about an American traveling through Europe who received the high privilege of being invited to call upon a Polish rabbi who was known far and wide as perhaps the wisest, holiest teacher on the entire continent. The American was shocked to find this great spiritual man living in a squalid little room with just a few bare sticks of furniture. "Rabbi," the American exclaimed, "where are all your things?" "Where are your things?" the rabbi replied. "Mine," said the American, "but I am not at home here. I'm just visiting." "Exactly," the rabbi replied, "and so am I." Where is your home? What does the word bring to mind? It may be the house in which you spent your childhood, or the house in which you raised your own children. It may be a dream you haven't yet achieved. An ideal you're still seeking. In truth, though, the deepest meaning of the word home can never be realized on this planet. No earthly place can really be uniquely home for our spiritual self. This doesn't mean we have no home. It means that we are home wherever we are, so long as we are centered in our true Christ self. It isn't where we are, but who we know ourselves to be that creates the sense of love, safety, and happiness that is truly home. Today, I unfold in prayer all those who feel themselves homeless, and all, perhaps including myself, whose sense of where home is shifts. We affirm for ourselves and for all others that in our eternal unity with the divine, we are always home. Thank you, God.